Whirlwind has finally arrived on the world stage in Diablo 4, and I am excited to bring you a complete breakdown of the build. The biggest question people ask me about this build is how to take your boss fight from 0 to hero. By the end of this video, you will have everything you need to know to do exactly that. I have some gameplay of a speed run for you, and then we'll break down the build. Now that is what I call a speed demon. Before we break down the build, I want to give everybody a heads up. This is running 4 different Uber uniques. Now all of them are not necessary. One of them is going to make a really big difference in the damage that you do, but we're going to cover that when we get to the gear section. If you're still looking to craft your first Uber, we'll talk about which ones you should craft first for this build, and we'll talk about replacements for what you can use if you don't have all of the Uber uniques. All right, let's take a look at the skill tree. Starting at the top, we're going to take 2 points into Lunging Strike. That's just to unlock our core skills. This build, even though it is a Whirlwind build, all of your damage does not come from Whirlwind. So we're going to be taking only 1 point into Whirlwind and 1 point into Enhanced Whirlwind for a little additional Fury. 3 points into Pressure Point. This is going to help give us more vulnerable enemies more often. Coming down to Imposing Presence, we're going to take 3 points here. We're going to take Rallying Cry. We're going to go through Enhanced Rallying Cry and Strategic Rallying Cry. If you're running into Fury issues with this build, you're going to take your point out of Strategic Rallying Cry and you're going to put it into Tactical Rallying Cry. This will give you 20% resource generation and 20 Fury every single time that you use Rallying Cry. Fury generation is not an issue for you, and we're going to cover some ways to help with your Fury generation. You're going to take this out and you're going to put it right back here. We're going to be running Iron Skin all the way down through Tactical Iron Skin. This is going to heal us and give us a barrier. It will also be something that's going to actually help us do more damage when we get to the breakdown of how the build works. Moving over, we're going to go 1 point into Warcry, and then we're going to go all the way through Power Warcry. We have a group of enemies around us, which we're going to be moving very quickly, so we're going to have enemies around us all the time. This is going to give us a 31% increase to damage instead of just a 21% increase to damage. We're going to do 3 points into Booming Voice. This is going to extend the duration of Warcry and of Rallying Cry. This is a speed farming build. So swiftness, we're taking 3 points for that extra 12%. I am nearly capped, and the cap for movement speed is 200. If you can move at 200% movement speed the entire time, your runs are going to be blazing fast. We're going to take 1 point into Leap, moving down through Enhanced Leap and into Power Leap. Damaging an enemy with Leap, you gain 40 Fury. When we don't have the Fury generation from Tactical Rallying Cry, we can gain that Fury generation, that initial Fury, from Leap. When we leap and hit an enemy, we'll gain 40 instead of the 20. So this is going to help at the very start of the run. When you haven't hit anybody yet, when Rallying Cry doesn't give you any resources, you leap once, you have enough Fury to start whirlwinding, and then your Fury shoots through the roof. We're going to be running 3 points in Aggressive Resistance. The way that this build is set up, we should always be berserking through the entire run. Now, because we're berserking, we're going to have 12% damage reduction. We're also going to be taking Battle Fervor. When a brawling skill damages at least one enemy, you gain berserking for 3 seconds. Every single time that we leap, which is a brawling skill, and we hit an enemy, we're going to gain berserking. The entire key to this build working correctly is being berserking. 100% of the time, if we are not berserking, we're going to be doing no damage. So this is a very, very important skill right here while we're running leap. We're also going to be running prolific fury. While berserking, we're going to generate 18% increased fury. Now, since we're generating fury while we're berserking, and we're berserking all the time, this is going to be a huge source of keeping our fury up while we're whirlwinding. Coming over here, we're going to be running Pit Fighter. 3 points here for a little extra damage to close and damage reduction from distant enemies. We're going to be doing 1 point into Hamstring. We're going to take 3 points into Cut to the Bone. This is going to increase our bleeding effects against vulnerable enemies by 15%. This build is based around bleed, so this is going to be a really big boost to our bleed damage. We'll be taking 1 point into Thick Skin. That's going to unlock counteroffensive. Whenever we're over 50% of Fortified, we're going to be doing 12% more damage. We're going to be taking Wrath of the Berserker for our ultimate. We're going to go all the way down through Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. This is going to give us extra damage when we're doing bossing, another source of berserking as well. We're going to take 3 points into Heavy-Handed. Critical strike damage plays a really, really big role in this build, so having that extra 15% is going to make a pretty big difference too. We're going to take 3 points into Wallop. While using a bludgeoning weapon, we're going to deal 15% more damage to enemies that are vulnerable. We're going to be using a two-handed mace for this build, so we're going to be gaining that 15% damage here. Finally, the key to this whole build. We're going to be taking Gushing Wounds. When causing an enemy to bleed, you have a chance equal to your critical strike chance to increase the bleed amount by 140% of your critical strike damage bonus. What does that mean? If you look at my stat line, I have 89.5% chance to crit, which means 89.5% of the time, I'm going to be increasing my bleed damage by 140% of my critical strike damage bonus, which is 3,922. That is a really, really big jump. That's a really, really big jump in the bleed damage that we're going to be doing. That is how you're going to be doing all of your damage and all of your single target damage. Those are the skills. Let's hop into the Paragon board. Heading down to the starter board, we're going to be running Wrath. Remember, critical strike damage is going to play a big role in Gushing Wounds. So we're going to max out this one here. Coming up into your Warbringer board. Because we're fortified all the time from Rallying Cry, we don't need to take the Warbringer legendary node. It frees up a lot of Paragon points to let us put them into other things that are very important as well. Inside the Warbringer board, we're going to be running Exploit. Vulnerable damage is actually going to be another source of multiplier that we're going to get to later on the Paragon board. So this is a very important glyph, which is why we put so many points into it. Moving over to the next board, this is where vulnerable damage is going to play a huge part in the damage that you're doing. We're going to be taking Hemorrhage. Your bleed damage is increased by 15% of your vulnerable damage bonus. What that means is that I take my vulnerable damage bonus, which is actually only 384%. This can go a little bit higher if you get better rolls on your gear than I have. It takes 15% of that, and then it increases it, and it changes it into a multiplicative number. So we now get additive damage bonus from vulnerable damage, and we get a multiplicative number to our bleed damage. This is going to be another source on top of Gushing Wounds that's going to make that Gushing Wounds proc much bigger than it already is. In this board, we're going to be running Blood Feeder. This is going to give us additional 5% increased critical strike chance against bleeding enemies. Now, if you saw, I'm already running 89.5% critical strike chance. When I add this 5% in, I'm at almost 95% chance to proc Gushing Wounds. If I can squeeze a little bit more critical strike chance out of this build, which I have room to do, I can run 100% chance to critical strike and hit Gushing Wounds. And that is going to be a massive source of damage here. Moving up, we're going to be going into your Blood Rage node. Blood Rage works very similar to the way that Hemorrhage works. It takes 10% of your damage while berserking bonus. This one, though, has a cap, right? You can only go up to 30%. I'm just under cap, so I just needed a slightly better roll on some of my gear, and I would have been at that 300%. So you're shooting for 300%, so you get the most out of this multiplicative number, as well as you're adding the damage while berserking, though, as well as adding the additive damage from damage while berserking. In this board, we're going to be running Ire. In order for me to get to that maximum level, I put all of the strength points that I could into this board. If you're over 300%, you can actually take some of these Paragon points out and put them into other areas of the board. It's going to be something you can play around with as you get your gear set up. But for this board and for my gear, this is the way that I had to set it up for this one. So I'm going to leave it right here like this. If your gear is different than mine is a little bit, then you can mess around with that glyph right there. Moving up into your decimator node. Each time you make an enemy vulnerable, your damage is increased by 10% for 5 seconds. Overpowering a vulnerable enemy grants an additional 10% bonus for 5 seconds. Whirlwind cannot overpower, but we're still going to be getting a 10% increase in damage while we make things vulnerable. Anywhere we can add any multiplicative numbers are going to be a very big increase to our damage, so this is also very important, even if Whirlwind will not overpower. In this board, we're going to be running a Disembowel. The reason that we're running this glyph is not for the physical damage over time. That's only going to make a very small difference to our bleed. What really is going to make a big difference is killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce a cooldown of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. As we move through the dungeons and things are dying, everything is dying from bleed. We have a chance now to reduce all of our shouts and leap by 1 second as we're killing things. So this is going to be a really, really big source of continuing movement, continuing shouts. Moving over, we're going to be going into the Bonebreaker node. Now, like I said, Whirlwind does not overpower, so we don't need to get the legendary node here. In this board, we're going to be running Marshall. This will help reset the cooldown of your Iron Skin and of your leap every single time that you use a shout. This is also giving our magic nodes in the range a bonus. Our magic nodes are the blue ones, so we're gaining at least 11% more damage reduction just by running Marshall in this board. Moving up into the Carnage board. Whirlwind does not scale off attack speed right now. They're changing that in the next season, but for now, we don't need to take this because we won't gain anything out of that. In the board, we're going to be running Might. Because we're going to be running a two-handed mace, this is going to give us another 8% multiplicative, as well as increase the rare nodes that we have in here to give us a little bit of extra damage reduction and a little bit of extra damage while berserking. That's the Paragon board. We're going to go take a look at the aspects, affixes, and all of the tempers for the gear. We're going to break down the gear. I'm going to start with just what I'm running. This is going to include the Uber Uniques. When we're done with that section, then we'll cover replacements, options, and tempers for our gear if you do not have all of the Ubers. For this particular build, if you are looking to craft your very first Uber Unique, I would highly suggest starting with your Grandfather. For most other builds, I would suggest running the Harlequin's Crest, but for this build, I would highly suggest the Grandfather here because it increases your critical strike damage by 100%. If you look at the stat line here, we have 3,922. As soon as I take this off, it drops down to 1,800. It's a really big increase to your gushing wounds when you're running the Grandfather. So for this build in particular, if you're looking to craft your very first Uber, I would highly suggest the Grandfather for this one. Starting for the helmet, we're going to be running the Harlequin's Crest. For your chest piece, we're going to be running Tyrael's Might. The reason that we're going to be running Tyrael's Might, while at full life, your skills unleash a Divine Barrage dealing 6,374. Now that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you get your character geared up, it actually can do millions of damage, and you're going to take that and convert it into bleed. Now with Whirlwind, this procs and goes out in a circle around you. As this is shooting out around you, it's hitting all of the enemies around you. Everything that's hitting at a distant or close to you is taking bleed damage because all of our direct damage is going to be converted into bleed. We'll talk about that in just a second. This is going to be a really big source of spreading bleed to a distant and basically turning our Barbarian into a ranged class and a close class at the same time. When I talked about Iron Skin earlier, I said that Iron Skin was going to play a really big part in making sure that we do extra damage. The skill here, we have to be at full life. We can't even have 1 HP missing. But we're going to be running Iron Skin. Iron Skin is not only going to heal us to full, it'll put a barrier on us so that if we are taking damage at all, the barrier is going to absorb that damage and will remain at full life. So this way, your Tyrael's Might will continue to proc. For the gloves, we're going to be running Fierce Winds. Your shout skills create 3 Dust Devils every single time that you use them. This also adds an additional multiplicative damage to your Dust Devils. Your Dust Devils are 20% bigger, and they deal 1% increased damage for each 1% of their size radius that gets increased. Right off the bat, we're going to get 20% here. As we get further into the gear, we're going to get that additional 80 to 100% increase to give us a big jump in damage to our Dust Devils. For the affixes, critical strike chance is going to be the most important part of this build. If you don't have high critical strike chance, but you have super high critical strike damage, you won't be doing much damage because you have to crit all the time. So getting that greater affix on crit, and then whatever else you can roll on that, that's how I built my build first. I went all critical strike chance, and then I found pieces of gear later on that had better affixes that I wanted on it. Lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. This really, really helps when you're doing boss fights. And then the resource cost reduction, if you don't have any fury issues, you actually can make that into vulnerable or critical strike damage. I'm a little low on vulnerable, so if I had a choice, that would be vulnerable damage. Now, when we get into the planner, I'm going to put in there what's going to look a little bit different than what you're going to see here. You don't have to mimic this gear because I'm just finding whatever I can find. In the planner, I'll have what I want to have optimally for the most damage and the best runs. For your tempers, we're going to be running crowd control duration and critical strike damage here. Moving down to the pants, we're going to be running Iron Warrior. This is going to give Iron Skin 35% extra damage reduction whenever it's used, and it's also going to grant us Unstoppable. Because it gives us an additional 35% damage reduction, it's going to make the barrier last even longer because we won't be taking as much damage and it won't eat up as much of the barrier as the monsters attack us. For the affixes, we're running Strength, Max Life, Armor, and then for the tempers, Iron Skin cooldown and crowd control duration. Moving down to the boots, we're running Relentless Berserker. Damaging an enemy with a core skill has a 30% chance to extend the duration of berserking by 2 seconds. If you critical strike chance, it's doubled. We'll get 4 seconds almost all the time because of how high our critical strike chance is. My movement speed is capped naturally. I don't need to use anything else to increase that. If your movement speed is not capped or is actually kind of low, you can always come here and then you can put on Ghostwalker. This will give you an additional 25% movement speed every single time that you become unstoppable. It's a great source of movement speed when you want to try and speed run if you don't have high movement speed naturally. Because I don't have to run Ghostwalker, I'm running Relentless Berserker. This is going to be optimal because you want to be able to keep your berserking up the entire time. For the affixes, we're going to be running movement speed, resistance to all elements, and war cry. For the tempers, we're going to be running barrier generation and movement speed as well. Remember, movement speed is life because this is a speed farming build. This is not for pushing the pits. Moving down to the weapon, we're going to be running Berserk Ripping. What Berserk Ripping does, it takes 60% of the direct damage that we inflict and converts it into bleed. We have 3 sources of direct damage with this build. 1 is Tyrael's Might, 2 is going to be our Whirlwind, and 3 is going to be our Dust Devils. That's why Gushing Wounds is so important. It's going to take 60% of the damage that we do, which is going to be a couple million, and then it's going to convert the bleed that we're going to be doing from Berserk Ripping and multiply that by 140% of our critical strike damage. So as we're shooting off our Dust Devils and we're shooting off Tyrael's Might, all of that damage is now going to be converted to bleed because we're running Berserk Ripping. This is key to this build running correctly. So you have to have this, and we want to get that 60% by putting it on a two-handed weapon, where we get more damage converted into bleed. On your two-handed weapon, this is actually going to be a really great source of keeping your fury up and making sure that you maintain fury generation. That 4 fury on kill is also going to be increased by your amount of fury generation. So it's not actually going to be 4, it's going to be a little bit higher depending on whatever your generation is. So we're going to run strength, fury on kill, critical strike damage. For the tempers, we're going to be running chance to cast Dust Devils twice and critical strike damage here as well. On your next weapon, we're going to be running Edge Masters. This is going to give all of our skills a 20% increase multiplicative to whatever it is based on our primary resource. Most of the time, we're going to be running completely capped on Fury. It's actually pretty crazy how high your Fury stays all the time, even though we're constantly spending it. For your affixes, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, Critical Strike Damage, and for the tempers, remember when we were talking about Fierce Wind? This is where we're going to have our increase to size, which is also going to increase our Dust Devil damage multiplicatively. This right here is going to give me an additional 50% damage to our Dust Devils. So getting that Dust Devil size on your weapons is actually going to be very important. We're also going to be running critical strike damage again on this build here. The next weapon, we're going to be running Devilish. After generating 100 Fury, your next direct damage creates 2 Dust Devils that deal damage along their path. Now, we're going to be getting a lot of Fury generation from Tyrael's Might, from your Dust Devils, and from Whirlwind. So this is going to proc constantly. For the affixes, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, and I have vulnerable damage on this because my vulnerable damage was actually a little bit low. Again, we're running Dust Devil size and critical strike damage. If you want to take advantage of the 100% increased damage, you can run 30, 50, and then 20 for your slashing weapon. We're going to be running the Grandfather. This we talked about a little bit earlier. It's going to increase your critical strike damage by 100%, massive boost. You will notice a big drop off if you don't get this weapon for this particular build. For the ring, I'm going to give you a couple different options for this. I'm currently running Intercom, which gives me a 10% increased multiplicative damage all the time. I'm never going to take advantage of this triple bonus here. So if there is something else that you want to run, your options here are going to be something like Bold Chieftain. Whenever you cast a shout skill, its cooldown is reduced by 2 seconds per nearby enemy up to 6 seconds. This is a great source for reducing the cooldowns of your shout if you feel like it's necessary. One of your other options here, you could always be running Elements. This will give you an additional 30% multiplicative number. The reason that I'm not running this is because it's only up for 7 seconds and then down for 7 seconds. All of the time I'm going to be gaining that bonus from Intercom, so that is the reason that I decided to run with this. If in the future I decide to update it, I will update the planner to switch it, but for now I've been running Intercom. For the affixes, we're going to be running Max Life, Critical Strike Chance, and Vulnerable Damage. If you're feeling tanky and you want to add more damage, you can replace the Max Life with Strength, but that Critical Strike Chance is critical. For the tempers, we're going to be running Warcry cooldown and then damage while berserking. I put my damage while berserking here. It can either go here or it can go on the one-handed weapons. This is where I needed to put it so that I could get to that 300%. Or if you remember, I was missing 10%. And if you look at that ring, I am 13% short of a max cap. So if I actually got a good roll here, then I would already be at that 300%. So you don't need to put it anywhere else. I don't need to change any Paragon points around. It would be perfect if I got a better roll here. So for our other ring, we're running the Ring of Starless Sky. The reason that we're running this ring, spending your primary resources reduces the cost of your skills and increases the damage by up to 50% multiplicative. As we're whirlwinding, our whirlwind costs 25. When we've maxed out and we've spent resources, our whirlwind will only cost 13. That is actually really, really big for generating fury because we need to generate fury to create more dust devils. On top of that, you're getting 50x damage increase. That is a huge number that we're just adding on just by running this here. It adds lucky hit chance, which are also going to help proc Relentless Berserker and keep our berserking up for longer. For the amulet, we're going to be running Dust Devils. Dust Devils changed the game for Whirlwind. Whirlwind leaves behind Dust Devils that deal damage to enemies. Whenever you cast Whirlwind, it leaves Dust Devils. So it's changed how we've played this. If you're channeling Whirlwind, every couple of seconds it will cast Dust Devils, but if you tap the Whirlwind button, or whatever you're going to be using to use Whirlwind, it will cast a Dust Devil every single time that Whirlwind is cast. So now, as we're running with this Whirlwind build, we're going to be setting it up so that we can constantly be spamming the Whirlwind button instead of holding it and channeling it as we go. It's going to increase your damage by a ton. For the affixes, we're going to be running movement speed, again, critical strike chance. And then I have lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable on this. I could replace that with vulnerable damage if I wanted to increase my damage a little bit, but I really like having that enemies vulnerable because it is actually a really, really big source of damage that I would be missing out on if the enemies weren't vulnerable. For the tempers, we're going to be running damage while berserking and imposing presence. So let's talk a little bit about not having any uber uniques, because there's running a lot in this build. And they each play a specific role in how this build works. If you want to replace the Ring of Starless Sky with something, you just take exactly what you're running on your other ring and you duplicate that. For the chess piece, this is a pretty easy swap. Running Rage of Haragoth is actually going to be a really big benefit to you when you're running these builds because you can reset the cooldowns of everything by a lot. Inflicting bleed on an enemy has up to a 40% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your skills, all of your skills, including your shouts, by 1 second. When I was testing this build, and this actually might be something that I end up running in the future, if you don't have access to a Harlequin's Crest, you can run a regular helmet with Strength, Max Life, cooldown reduction. For your tempers, you're going to want to run Imposing Presence. And for your utility, you're going to be running Crowd Control Duration or Barrier Generation. Either one is going to be a great option for you. The weapon is a little trickier. Like we talked about, the Grandfather increases your damage by a ton. Running a pole arms this season is actually going to be very, very beneficial to any build because of the multiplicative number that it adds to damage. It would require a completely different Paragon board, but there is Paragon boards out there, and there are builds out there that do not run Uber Uniques. Using a polearms will be a great source of direct damage that is going to do actually quite a bit more damage than your Grandfather would or your bludgeoning weapon would because of that increase to damage. For the tempers, you're going to go over to your rogue, and you're going to put critical strike damage on there. Then you're going to come here and you can run either Dust Devil damage or chance to cast Dust Devil twice. Your Dust Devil size caps out at 100%. So you don't need to run any more than that. Those are going to be your options if you're not running any Uber Uniques. It's going to change the way that the build feels a little bit. Really, the biggest piece of gear that you really need to get for this build to work really well is going to be the Grandfather. Let's take a look at the expertise. We're running two-handed axe expertise. This is going to give us that 10% multiplicative number to vulnerable enemies. The way that expertise works, you don't have to be running the weapon that is assigned to get that bonus. This will allow me to run a sword like the Grandfather and gain the benefit of running an axe also. For the skill assignments, we're going to be running a bludgeoning weapon on Whirlwind. We're going to be running a bludgeoning weapon on Leap. The reason that we're doing this, if you look at what it does, you deal 15% multiplicative increased critical strike damage while berserking. The reason that's important is because we're going to be running Gushing Wounds, and Gushing Wounds scaled based off your critical strike damage. This is going to be a really big increase to your damage while we're using Whirlwind. That's the setup. I'm going to go to the training grounds and I'll show you the gameplay loop, how it works. We'll talk about speed running tactics, how to keep up berserking at all times. Let's hop in. So for your gameplay loop, remember, we need to be berserking the entire time. How we gain berserking. Warcry grants berserking, Wrath of the Berserker grants berserking, and whenever you hit an enemy with Leap, it's also going to grant berserking. When we pop our cooldowns, we do not generate any Fury, so we have to make sure that we hit with Leap or we take damage. Looking at what your Fury says, Fury is generated when using certain skills or taking damage. So when we take damage, we generate Fury. So if you're running into a group of enemies, they start attacking you, you're going to generate your Fury. A couple things about your abilities. With Leap, if you're running a mouse and keyboard, wherever you put your mouse, that is where your Leap is going to go to. If you only want to leap right to here, then you only put your mouse here, you use Leap. If you want to leap all the way out to here, put your mouse out here. If you're running on a controller, it's a lot different. Leap has almost a set distance for you. If there are enemies, it will auto-target them and go a little bit further, but if there are no enemies around you, it has a very set distance. If you want to be able to leap in place on a controller, you have to stop moving completely and then leap, and it will just let you leap straight up in the air and come back down. It's great for bossing. So as soon as you're about to get your berserking back up, stop moving for just a second, hit the leap button, and then you can continue moving again. So we're going to start by leaping into this group of enemies here. That will generate our Fury, and then, like I said before, we're going to start just tapping your Whirlwind button. We do not press and hold. We're going to be tapping it so that we're going to generate as many Dust Devils as we possibly can. We're going to start by leaping into this group of enemies. Now, berserking. We talked about earlier that we need to be berserking in order for our hits to deal bleed damage. Bleed is going to be our biggest source of damage here. What the berserking buff looks like, it's this purple one here. With Relentless Berserker, that will constantly stay up as long as we get the lucky hit chance, and we're going to be critting or hitting enemies with Whirlwind. I'm going to leap into some enemies, watch for that buff just to see how often it stays up. We're going to be tapping the Whirlwind button after we leap in, and that'll continue to keep up that buff for us. If that falls off, we're going to use Warcry. If that falls off, then we can leap again, or we can use Wrath of the Berserker. We're going to start by leaping, and then we're just going to start spamming. If you can see, our berserking buff is constantly being refreshed because of our lucky hit chance. It hasn't fallen off yet, and if it does fall off, then we pop Warcry, and we're going to be doing additional damage here. So that is going to be the way that you run this build. Our bleed ticks are going to get higher and higher the more that we do with Wrath of the Berserker, and the longer we keep berserking up. But for this build, and the gameplay loop that we're going to be doing, you're going to leap through around to make sure that berserking stays up for boss fights. Most of the time it will be only one enemy. Occasionally we'll have more, but we're not going to be able to keep up our berserking as often. So we're going to have to make sure that we're rotating so it fell off. Now we're going to use Warcry. So if you pop all of your abilities at one time, you're going to lose all of your damage. So that fell off, so now we use Wrath of the Berserker. We're going to watch our cooldown, and as long as till it falls off, then now we're going to leap to get that back up. So it's now fallen off, so we have nothing up until Warcry comes back up. So you're going to have to manage your cooldowns well enough to make sure that we keep berserking up and that we keep our bleed damage going. That is going to be the rotation when you're fighting a boss. For these builds, you want to be close enough for Whirlwind to hit the enemies, but not close enough that they hit you. Remember, Materials Might only works when we have full health. So if we don't have full health, it's not going to be proccing, and the proc from Materials Might, it looks like those bolts that are flying out from around us. Those are going to be very important for spreading our bleed damage everywhere. That's the build right there. It is a ton of fun to play. It's super fast. The more you play, the better it gets. Make sure you get your master working to 12. Don't wait. If you saw I have a mace that has 0 greater affixes, but I went straight to 12 with it, your character is going to feel so much stronger, and it will be at the absolute strongest it possibly can be with everything at 12. Now I'm working on rerolling and finding better gear. Let me know what you think of the build in the comments. I'm live on YouTube and Twitch pretty much every night. Stop by, tell me what you think, theorycraft with me. Let's try something new with this build. It's a ton of fun. I'll see you there.